Hello, this is John Majori with Majori on Bowie, and this is the Majori on Bowie YouTube channel, where I have a new interview every week that always has something to do with David Bowie. And for daily content, visit the blog www.majorionbowie.com, where I have new content every single day that almost always has something to do with David Bowie. And today I'm very excited to be joined once again by Don Klees. Don is the author of On Track David Bowie, 1983 to 2016, which is part of the On Track series of books that covers an artist's entire output song by song. Bowie got two books, and Don's covers the second half of Bowie's career. And I'll link to our first interview, which was about the book, in the show description here. It's a great conversation. I really enjoyed talking with Don about his book, and I really enjoyed the book. And I remember when I was reading it, um, although it does not focus specifically on the album Heathen, it's in the middle of the book because it's kind of in the middle of the second half of Bowie's career. And I remember while reading it that, Heathen is it's really a great album, and it might not get the due that it really deserves. It sort of gets caught in the middle. Uh, but I wonder if it was released at a different point in Bowie's career, if it would be recognized as a great or near great album. And I really wanted to talk to Don a little bit more about Heathen. So Don, welcome back.
Thank you, John. It really is a pleasure to be back. I enjoyed our conversation as well. I'm glad you did. It's certainly implicit that you enjoyed it because we wouldn't be here otherwise. And and it's funny too that you say that because when there was a certain point in the when you get into the real uh, nitty gritty of editing, and the publisher says, you're slightly over your page count and we're going to need to cut some things, and you don't really want to cut anything necessarily. Well, actually, I take that back. There were a few points where I was starting to go off into some kind of pretentious tangents, which I was glad for the opportunity to say, nope, don't need that. However, it was tough at times to cut some of those things out. But what a side effect of that, and it was kind of a fun one in retrospect, was that it also led to me seeing what albums did I spend the most time on in this book. And I didn't set out to privilege any particular album. Interestingly, Blackstar ended up being a relatively brief chapter. Now, some of that was because there were only 7 songs on it. The EP No Plan got its own uh, piece there, but it got its own little section. But it was interesting to see that Heathen was one of the albums that I did spend the most time talking about, and that certainly reflects to some extent it being a personal favorite of mine. And I think coincidentally or not, it does also reflect that it is a pretty significant album for Bowie artistically and the whole kind of arc of his work. And and it's also interesting to think of it too, that about the level of acclaim that it got, as you were alluding to, because it was certainly respected at the time,
Yeah.
maybe more so in the UK, where I think he he often had more, kind of partisans favoring him in the UK than he did in the US,
Yeah.
perhaps. And that's there's a lot of reasons for that. I think that the album, it's sometimes you look and you at the reviews for his albums, and the ones with maybe a little more of a rock oriented lean maybe got a little bit more of a favorable review from US critics. That's like any generalization, that of course risks the potential for contradiction. But it is interesting to see that comparatively between Heathen and Reality, the album that followed this, which was
Yeah.
definitely a little more of a straightforward play it live kind of record, that that I think reality was slightly better received in the US than it was in the UK, and maybe and vice versa. You know, and you make it, and it is interesting to see how that how this album again was definitely respected. It definitely kind of restored Bowie to that kind of top rank of rock legends, I guess you could say. And yet it is now overshadowed somewhat because of obviously the events that followed not quite 15 years later, and the absolute tidal wave of acclaim that Blackstar got. Not to mention the
Right.
tidal wave of acclaim that the next day got after, of
Yes.
course, so long, so much silence, on Bowie's part. But it really is. Heathen really is. It's a hell of an album.
Yeah.
And it's fun. It is funny to think about. I mean, I like. I mean, I assume like me, you probably got it the day it came out, or at least the
Yes.
week it came out, and probably listened to it several times in succession. Probably listened to a few favorite songs on loop and all that. And it really it definitely it definitely stuck with me. It's an album I certainly come back to a lot.
Yeah. Before we get into the album itself, I want to. There's so many things you mentioned that I want to touch on that I want to go back to, but let's talk a little bit about the sort of a cross current of contexts. And the one is the context, and you sort of alluded to this of where the album fits into Bowie's discography, and then also the context of the time. It came out in 2002, but
Hmm.
in terms of Bowie's discography, um, he had by the late 90s, he had released Outside and Earthling, which were two, high intensity, loud rock albums. And then he came out with Hours, which I don't think is as well regarded. It wasn't at the time. I don't think it is today. But I think of Hours as, if you think about the cover of Hours, it shows the Bowie's last manifestation, either dead or exhausted, in the arms of his new manifestation, sort of like the Pieta. And I think of it as his first middle-aged album, but it doesn't quite click. And then Heathen, and Heathen does click. So just in terms of the context of his discography, um, what is Bowie doing?
Right. That great question. And one thing that's funny about the book that I wrote about him, I'd written a couple books for this publisher beforehand, and those books had been part of a series they have called Decades, where you look at a decade in the life and work of a particular artist.
Yeah,
And what was interesting about those was that by design, you weren't just focused on the albums. Obviously, they played a big part in it, but you were looking at other stuff that's going on. Like in the book I did about Bob Dylan in the 80s, I spent a fair amount of time talking about the tour they did with the Grateful Dead, for example, or touring with Tom Petty. And none of which was there were some recordings that were tied to that, but for the most part, it was just a live experience. And with Bowie doing this book, the On Track series, which by design again is more focused on the music, I didn't go perhaps in depth as much as I would have liked to about I think a pretty pivotal event in his kind of later years, and that was his appearance at the Glastonbury Festival in June of
yeah,
2000, and that was not exactly between Hours and Heathen, but it does make a really interesting kind of demarcation point because the Glastonbury Festival is such a big deal in the UK, and but Bowie's performance basically became instantly the stuff of legend,
yeah,
and it was. I think it's appreciated now more outside of the UK because the full concert has been released, not just the audio but also the video, and that was a moment where Bowie, at least in the UK, really just reclaimed his stature,
Yeah.
for lack of a better term, and because I think some of it was that it had been, and it's funny because the release of that concert we can find it's definitely worth picking up because it includes his diary entries, and Bowie doesn't he's a little bit guarded, and so to get something fairly uh, just forthright like this was interesting because he talked about how he had not done a real kind of greatest hit show for a decade, but the Glastonbury Festival was designed to be very much that. And so he had in that moment really he put out the sort of the highlight, the iconic highlights of his body of work for that massive audience in the UK, and it did, I think, maybe show him as a person who realized that his past and his future were not enemies,
Yeah.
and I think that that maybe did lay groundwork in a variety of ways for Heathen. Maybe it represented a degree of making peace with those songs, realizing that he didn't need to avoid them, but which he kind of had been for the past decade. In 1990, he did his Sound and Vision tour. The hey, if you want to see me play these songs ever again for certain, you better see me now. I make no promises thereafter tour, which was very cool. Not my
Well,
favorite Bowie
well,
tour, but a good tour.
he claimed that he would never perform them again.
Well, his wording was always a
Yeah.
little slick. He definitely was um there were times he seemed a little more emphatic about it. Other times he
Yeah.
did. I mean, hey, keep in mind, within a couple years of doing that tour, he played Heroes at the Freddie Mercury
Yes.
benefit show with the
Annie
surviving members
Lennox.
of
Yeah.
Queen and stuff. So he wasn't totally dead set on it, but I think I think for him, in the 90s, he certainly played old songs in concert, but it wasn't going to be the big hits. It was stuff like Teenage Wildlife,
Right.
and which, by the way, was awesome. He
Yes.
played that on the Outside Tour, just awesome. But again, I digress. I mean, I'm a walking, talking digression. Sorry about that. But he those '90s albums. What I think they did for him was they definitely reestablished him as a genuinely creative artist.
Yeah.
Like nobody could really, I think, come away from listening to Outside and not thinking, man, this is a person who they're not resting on their reputation. A lot of artists of that generation, by the time they got to the 90s, they're kind of resting on their reputation. I like the Rolling Stones a lot, but let's face it, by the 1990s, they're resting on their reputation. And but that wasn't Bowie. That
Yeah.
he wasn't going to go that way. And you
So
know,
Don, you're saying a lot, and there's so much I want to I want to comment on. So I'm just going to interrupt you. So there's
thank God.
two things in particular. So you mentioned Outside, and one of my favorite Bowie albums, flat out, one of my favorite Bowie albums. I also saw him on the tour, and it was a great concert. I saw that in Pittsburgh. Amazing concert. When he died, and there were all those retrospectives about his career, I was shocked to read how mixed a reception Outside had, and both referring to how it was received at the time, which I just thought was great at the time, and I still think it's
Mhm.
great, but also in retrospect, and in a lot of the stories that were written about Bowie's career in 2016 uh, did not all of them referenced Outside as a great album. So to take this in a direction you're not necessarily expecting, something that I've been contemplating have meant to write about, but I haven't really fully articulated my thought as will come across in the question. Um, did the Sound and Vision tour actually hurt Bowie's career? Is that the point where he became somebody who could do a greatest hits tour? And was he sort of reoriented himself as somebody whose career was in the past. So what came out after was not necessarily like if you think about when you think about the book that you wrote, right? How much of that seems like it's not part of, I don't know, the canon or what people think of when they think of Bowie, but there's all this rich material that came after. Like
Mhm.
he wasn't expected to be still putting out great music.
Absolutely, absolutely true. And I think that I think your point is well taken that at the time the reception was definitely mixed for the album itself. I
Yeah,
think that though what even among a lot of those mixed reviews, what you find is people still respecting his ambition.
yeah, yeah,
And I think that's where and look, as much as I love the album, that I can point to things about it and say, well, that doesn't hold up as well as it could. And the narrative is in some ways the narrative is the weakest part of it. It's it was a I think it stands up as a fascinating springboard for how he that led him to some of these incredible songs. But as a whole, it's in some ways it's probably best that it's kind of left as it is, as maybe a little more of an abstraction, because I think a song like "The Voyeur of Utter Destruction is Beauty" has a lot more impact just as this piece of music that or the motel is another one. I think sometimes I think the narrative was maybe a means to an end, but what did come out of it though still was it showed people this is not a person who is content to live in the past. Now I think you made an interesting point the about the Sound and Vision tour, and did it hurt him? I don't know if it hurt him. I think that at the time maybe he saw that as the best way to resolve that tension between his past work that had achieved this great recognition and his desire to keep doing something different, because you really can't find as much like we talk about the Berlin trilogy when
yeah,
we talk Low, Heroes, and Lodger, and yes, there's things that link them, but you know, um, but of course they weren't all done in Berlin for starters, so they're already that trilogy concept fractures on the face of it. We talk about how much he worked with Eno. Well, as Tony Visconti sometimes had to point out to people, Eno didn't produce those albums. That was Tony
yes,
Visconti doing that.
yes,
And also they're still very different records. They're so
yes,
different records. I mean, Lodger, eh, I'm not going to mistake a song on Lodger for a song on Low.
right.
They're so Bowie was always, even when he was kind of notionally working in the same space musically, there's still a big difference. I mean, Outside and Earthling have a lot of commonalities in style. Still super different albums. Even Ziggy and Aladdin Sane. I mean, and those are also, again, they're one is sort of an outgrowth of the other, but they're still very different records. So I think that restlessness, I think that restlessness for Bowie is tough. You saw the Glass Spider tour, if I
Yeah,
remember
yes,
correctly.
yeah.
I
First,
think that's a
first
point.
concert. Yeah,
Yeah, and that's a great to me. That's a great example of that tension there, because on the one hand, you've got the most of the greatest hits. Certainly the recent hits like Modern Love and China Girl, but they're and the Stone Cold classics like Heroes, and that's a great version of Heroes did on that tour. Not quite Live Aid good, but still really damn good. But then on the other hand, you've got stuff like All the Madmen,
yes.
and
People don't
so
remember that.
they don't, right?
Yeah,
And that to me sort of embody or Big Brother, and that to me to me that just always seemed indicative. Like I didn't necessarily understand at the time. I had to kind of work through the body of work to kind of to have it all uh, come into focus. but then when you realize that there was that tension, that on the one hand he's playing a big stadium show, so he knows he's got to play these big hits, or at least some of the big hits, but he also but his restless heart not only does it's going to play some of the new stuff, which, whatever his comments retrospectively, I think he enjoyed some of those songs and Never Let Me Down a lot more than he let on after the fact. But he there's my absolute unpopular opinion, Bowie opinion of the whole podcast, by the way. But he also wanted to go back into those really deep and, in the case of all the Mad Men and Big Brother, pretty dark corners
Yeah.
of his catalog. And those, by the way, some of the same dark corners he went into in the Outside tour, when he's going to play a song like Joe the Lion or Teenage Wildlife. And so I think he figured that the best way to reconcile that tension between the experimental side and the person capable of producing this iconic popular art was to say, well, I'm going to compartmentalize the popular stuff. I'm going to give people a fair chance to see it. I saw the Sound and Vision tour in Philly. He played 4 nights in Philly. He gave people plenty of opportunity to to see Rebel Rebel and Ashes to Ashes, and then he decided he wanted to do different things. I
At the
think
time, he was doing Tin Machine, right?
right, and
Yeah.
which is and I mean that's a whole that chapter is is very interesting. I mean, I think the first Tin Machine album in particular, uh, if it has some very prescient material on it, certainly his commentary on the rise of white supremacist
Yeah.
groups in the song Under the God feels as on point today as it ever did.
Yeah.
And so yeah, I think it took him some time to maybe to get comfortable with. I think Bowie, the popular artist, the guy who I think who appreciated his stardom and appreciated the stature he had. Uh, I think that part of his artistic existence needed time to come back around uh, to the experimental part. I think about like, and maybe some of it's, the sort of shock to the system that was Let's Dance and the fame that followed it. I'm sure that's part of it. He needed time to course correct in his own psyche, maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah, again, which I shouldn't say. I mean, I shouldn't psychologize. Someone I've psychoanalyzed, rather, someone I've never met. But again, you do wonder. But I think, though, that but by the time he did Heathen, I think he I think he recognized that legacy was something that should be embraced. And I think maybe that led to him saying, being willing to certainly, I think it helped him feel comfortable reconnecting with Tony Visconti as a producer.
Yeah.
And I think because there was both, because I think it was probably a comfortable relationship in a way, but also a challenging one too, because they had that work to live up to, kind of like with Eno on Outside. There
Yeah.
was a reputation to live up to, and maybe Tony Visconti may not be the sort of uh, brand name, for lack of a better term, as Brian Eno, but he's still a, a, a producer of incredible stature. Uh, you know, like, he has seen and done it all, and so if anybody was going to push Bowie, it was going to be him.
Yeah.
So I think Ethan does come out of that. I think you have an artist who's, on the one hand, comfortable with their place in among the rock gods,
Yeah.
uh, but at the same time, also, in many ways, a new dad, a person who is in their mid 50s, who is probably wondering a lot about what the hell kind of world are we living in.
Yeah. So
Eh,
let me try to
yeah,
sum up some of what you've been saying and see if I got this right, and then that will bring us back to Heathen. I'm going to inject some of my own
please.
observation into this, but the Sound and Vision tour in 1990 was his attempt to kind of put to bed his past catalog to open the door to experimentation. So he was doing Tin Machine, something like the Buddha of Suburbia in its own way is experimental or it's
Oh yeah.
defiant, right? Outside, you were talking about how ambitious it is. And by the time he got to Glastonbury, he's essentially, I don't want to say resurrecting his past catalog, but reconciling with it.
Hmm.
And it was so well received. I mean, I think, when you still read references to that concert to this day as being like the greatest Glastonbury concert ever. I'm not making that up, right? I mean, it's like
No,
every
no,
year. Yeah.
absolutely.
And he was mostly performing old songs, but he was like okay with that.
Yeah,
So Heathen, if you think about Heathen compared to Tin Machine or Buddha of Suburbia or Outside, it's not as experimental in that respect, right? It's a more conventional type of album, but
yeah,
you're also, you alluded to he's a man in his mid 50s. He's no longer, he couldn't be Ziggy Stardust, right? Because Ziggy is not a guy in his mid 50s. He's a
no, by
father.
design. Yeah,
Yeah. And he's thinking about the world that his baby daughter is going to grow up in. And that sort of brings me to the other context, which is what's the state of the world at that time? So the album came out in 2002, but he's making it in 2001. What's happening? And given what was happening, how was the album received once it was released?
yeah. Well, it did obviously retrospectively become perceived as his response to 9/11. And I've not come across any specific comment from Bowie himself on that. But when I was kind of just doing research for this book, Tony Visconti, when who even by that time, had become a very was often asked about his work with Bowie at that point. He said that he insisted that they really didn't change much in the way of lyrics
Yeah.
in the aftermath of the 9/11 events in New York. And they but it's funny though, because on the one hand, I can totally see why that perception exists. It's funny because the title song, there's I mean the opening lyrics or something like "Steel on the skyline, sky made
Yes.
of glass." It's like, well,
Yeah.
yeah, I mean you could totally see how someone would get that impression. But yeah, I mean he um as far as the timeline, I think they started recording at the studio, which was in like the Catskills in August of 2001, and it was a place where they were able to live on site because it'd been like this estate or whatever, and so they were there, they were living there, working there, and I guess Bowie's daughter would have been about 1 year old at the time, and I've definitely heard Bowie talk about like anxious moments after the attack, or like when he couldn't reach Iman to make sure she was safe. And Tony Visconti was trying to reach his son, who also lived in Manhattan at the time. Uh, so I mean, I think that anxiety perhaps seeped into it, whether it was conscious or not. But I don't think it was. Um, I don't certainly don't think it was really intended as a response to 9/11. Certainly not in the same way that Bruce Springsteen's album The Rising was
Yeah.
intended as kind of a response to those events.
Yeah.
I think there's a quote from Tony Visconti that I came across once where he talked about when he heard the songs that Bowie was coming up with, and that he said to Bowie something to the effect of, "You're addressing God with these songs, aren't you?"
Yeah.
And and definitely when you listen to a song like "A Better Future," where he
I
says
was
like,
gonna
"I
say,
demand a
yeah.
better future, or I might just stop loving you," that 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 element in it, and I Would Be Your Slave certainly has that that feel to it. So there is that that undercurrent in a lot of the songs about a person just uh, dealing with again some very fundamental questions about existence and probably the kind that uh, I he himself would probably would have said he might not have been uh, well well placed maybe psychically to psychologically to have addressed when he first became a parent. But I think with all that experience he had, and I think when he got his sort of second chance, with with his daughter Alex and Amon, I think he definitely was in that place and able to articulate these feelings. I mean, I was definitely, I was, you know, as someone who was pushing middle age when the album came out, I certainly, I think, related to a lot of these sentiments and some of the songs, yeah, probably more than others, but in that respect, yes, I think it was it maybe not um, it may not have been intended as a response to 9/11, certainly, but certainly that event does cast a shadow. But I think the bigger, more prevalent shadow was just simply a person who's aware that of their, you know, you know, of getting older and maybe this concept of legacy, not legacy in the sense of him being worried about how he's going to be perceived by critics or anything, but I think how again like about whether he um, did right by his family.
Yeah.
Not just Iman and Alex, but also his son. From his first marriage.
So let me throw this at you. Uh, you mentioned a few of the songs, and in my mind, and I have a list up in front of me of the songs. I can't just rattle them off the top of my head, but I in my mind, there's three types of songs on the album. And the one that we'll set aside are the covers because
Sure.
I'm going to telegraph this question, but I'm not going to ask it yet, which is what are they doing on the album? But I'm going to come back to that. But then the other two types are you alluded to songs that really seem like he's wrestling with sentiments, with feelings, with anxiety. And I would put into that category Slip Away, Slow Burn, Afraid, I Would Be Your Slave, Everyone Says Hi, and A Better Future. But then the other three songs that don't fall into those first two categories are Sunday, 5:15, The Angels Have Gone, and Heathen, The Rays, which seem
Hmm.
to be describing something that seems to be describing the aftermath of a calamity, which I think, the sort of emotional songs seem to be grappling with this anxiety that was in the air. But those three songs, they seem to be describing something that happened, which I think of those as the most 9/11 type songs. But I before we started talking, I also sent you my thought about Sunday as being of a piece with 5 years Panic in Detroit and Diamond Dogs in the sense that 5 years is the apocalypse is coming. Panic in Detroit as it's happening. Diamond Dogs as it's come, been, and gone. And then Sunday is much later in the future. Nothing remains, right?
I mean, that's a valid interpretation, I think. I think I would probably personally put Slow Burn more in that category with
Yeah,
the with the more kind of dystopian leaning songs.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
I think sometimes it's I think maybe the fact that it is a little more of a straight ahead kind of rocker and those horns and stuff maybe kind of make it sound a little more comforting than it really is. But to me it always felt like there was a little bit of that of a darker undercurrent. When he talks about days being the darkest of all and everything. So he's um but I think that certainly Sunday and Heathen, and they really are perfect bookends to the album in that respect. And I think there
Yeah.
was a quote from Bowie, some in that he gave around the album. I mean, sort of talking about those two songs as being ones that he didn't necessarily want to write those lyrics, but he just couldn't help himself that those sentiments, those thoughts, and came out of it. And yeah, it is you know a record that is embracing the darkness in its respect. I mean, and certainly, there's definitely songs in there that are, I wouldn't call them hopeful per se, but are maybe have a little more of you know a little more lightness to them. I mean, I think Slip Away perhaps gives um gives a little bit of that nostalgic,
Yes.
air.
Yeah.
And um although but then again, you've also got a song like Everyone Who Says Hi, which has in some sense a very kind of uplifting melody. But when uh, there was there was a live performance that Bowie did, I think it was for BBC Radio, where he talked about the origins of that song, and being in this in the way that he could never fully reconcile the idea that when people dying, being gone forever, and how his mind would
Yeah.
try to tell him they were just off on this big long holiday and all that. And so he's but yeah, but but talking about it here, maybe one of the things that just kind of hits me is that we don't really think of Bowie as a sort of emotionally forthright singer and songwriter
Right.
in the same way that we think of of McCartney or even Neil Young in that way, um, or even like the Bob Dylan of Blood on the Track. But I think that maybe sometimes because he does um, deal so much in not abstraction, but um, because his lyrics are often very oblique, I think sometimes we do lose sight of how much genuine feeling he puts forth in his songs. And I think Heathen is probably a case in point
Yeah.
in that, of
Well,
someone, you know, dealing with a lot of pretty deeply held feelings.
as I'm speaking to you, I'm 56 years old, and now that I'm in the age bracket that he was in when he made this album, I recognize some of the themes he's grappling with are the themes that a middle-aged man grapples with.
Mm-hmm.
I liked the album at the time, but I don't think I fully appreciated it at that time. Let me ask you this: is it
Yeah.
slightly simplistic question? Why do you think it's called Heathen? Both the song and the album.
That's a good question. I mean, uh, I think he's definitely used religious imagery in his songs before, and I think that um, and certain, like, you can go back to what was it, Loving the Alien, and
Yeah,
certainly used um, that word before. No, I mean, that is a good question, and of course, and I'm sure that also did feed into the some of the perception of it as his response to the 9/11 terrorist attacks. But no, I don't know. That's one. I
yeah.
I I'm
I don't
I'm
know either, by the way. I don't have
Yeah,
it.
I'm funny. With Bowie, it's a funny thing. I I I try I try not to go too deep down that rabbit hole of
Yeah,
analyzing the lyrics, because I think sometimes I'm just you know I like he Bowie's what Bowie's just one of those artists for me who um I think sometimes I'm obviously the the musical inventiveness is, is obviously just, is a great thing. But sometimes for me, it really is the feeling of the song and that atmosphere that comes with it. And I think, sometimes I don't want to go, you know, too deep down it, because sometimes it really is just, it is not so much that specific wording, but the way those words, you know, play off of each other, collide with each other,
Yeah.
um, and that, the sound and the feeling of them that, that sometimes works there. So yeah, so sometimes with these questions, I don't, I try not to go too down deep into it. Now, of course, having said that, I was talking to one of my kids earlier about the song "Slip Away," and I was trying to explain the Uncle Floyd show to them, and which is funny because I got to see as a kid, even though I didn't live in New York, where I did live, I got to see TV from New York, so I was familiar with the Uncle
Yeah.
Floyd show, and um, and so, and so I'm pretty sure the lyric about how you were you were fun, but we were dumb, is a reference to, is Bowie talking about him and Iggy Pop being the dumb ones there. But again, that's like kind of as much as I really want to go down. I don't want to get too deep into biographical analysis beyond
Do you want
that.
to hear one of my deep analyses of a lyric from that song?
Absolutely.
In space, it's always 1982, right? So
Yeah.
1982 is right before Let's Dance.
Yep.
Space is, for Bowie, space is stasis. It's where he retreats, but nothing happens other than maybe a
Yeah.
very slow decay, like Ashes to Ashes. Major Tom's been up there for a while.
Yeah.
And it's right before his whole identity changes, right? 1982. And
Yeah.
he might even be lamenting. I mean, the whole album is like a lament.
Well, that it's funny because I remember, you know, um, one of the toughest things about writing a book is starting the book.
Yeah.
And and I remember that, when I did start writing this, which is it's been like 2.5 years now since I started writing that, which is crazy to think about. But but one of the things I where I decided to land, uh, and thankfully it worked out, because I've as a starting point, but was to point out that that time, 1982, that was possibly the most weirdly quiet time for him. Like, up
Right.
to that point, when he had been, he released two albums in 1977, not to mention producing Iggy Pop.
Yeah.
He had done, so the fact that he had some scare between Scary Monsters and Let's Dance, he basically, if you take out the performances that were released from the BBC play he did, that,
Val. Yeah.
Pal, yeah, he did the original version of Cat People and Under Pressure,
Right.
and that's it.
Yeah.
Which, and there were business reasons for that, as far as like his contract with his old manager and stuff. But it also sort of shows that for the most part, he was not an artist who, um, he was not one to particularly, sit around, at least, up to that point. I mean, um, even when you look at his 80s work, we had, so, you had Let's Dance in 83, you had Tonight in 84, and okay, his next album doesn't come out until 1987, but in between that was all the stuff he did for soundtracks and whatever.
Yes.
And that's like a full album right in there. So
Yeah.
there
Isn't
was
that an
always,
album waiting to be released?
right. I mean, that's
Yeah.
that's the thing. It's like there's so much in there. So I think he was always that kind of restless individual until he kind of, until he did hit that point, after the tour for Reality, where he decided he was, um, he was good for a while, and,
Yeah.
that he wanted to just, you know, um, live his life, and be there as with his family, which is
Yeah.
you know was an amazing thing, and then of course it um I mean that's a whole other conversation about how things happen after that, but yeah, I mean Heathen really in all of that, it's amazing to think, like, at the time, like, I don't think anyone listening to it could ever have predicted the 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 path he would follow from there.
After Heathen.
Like after
Yeah.
Heathen. Yeah, I mean, there
Yeah.
like there's no I mean, there's nothing like it. There's no artist that I think has ever um through that kind of as sort of voluntarily removed themselves um from kind of public life like that, and then obviously come back with such amazing work. I mean, you know, there's maybe a little bit of precedent with John Lennon, and because he spent, because Bowie, and you could argue that Bowie was sort of emulating Lennon a little bit, because Lennon spent several years not really recording or doing anything with music in the late 70s, before he got back into doing stuff. And but yeah, there really was, nothing like it at the time. And
So we're getting close to another contextual issue, but before we get to that, I want to, I telegraphed I was going to ask you this. There are three covers on the album.
yeah,
The second song is Cactus, which is a cover,
yep,
and then I've Been Waiting for You, which is a Neil Young song, and I took a trip on a Gemini spacecraft, which was by the legendary Stardust Cowboy,
hmm
and I like all three songs. I like them very much. In fact, I heard Bowie's version of all three before I heard the original versions of all three, and so I think of
right,
them
right,
as the as the real versions, even with the
yeah.
Neil Young song, right? But what are they doing on this album? They're thematically they seem like they're not
That
consistent.
Yeah, and personally, and I may have mentioned this last time we talked, but I always felt the placement of Cactus on the album was a little bit
You did say
weird.
this.
Like
Yes.
that maybe the one thing that keeps that like the one area where I just sort of maybe fault Heathen a little bit is sometimes the way that the sequencing of the songs isn't always to their best advantage. I mean, I get it on the one hand because Sunday and Slip Away are both fairly meditative, and you want to kind of break it up a little bit. Um, but I don't know if Cactus is the way to do it. Uh, I think honestly, I and again, you hate to psychoanalyze someone from afar, under any circumstances, but to me, I think it's a little bit of he you know, these were all well, the legendary Stardust Cowboy, first off, was uh, the backstory with that individual is is a little crazy, and probably too involved to go into here. But it obviously was sort of it was a it could be seen as sort of a callback to those early days of his life, and in that sense, not unlike the kind of callback to the earlier days of his life that we get on Slip Away.
Yeah.
Um, you know, and this is definitely getting into a little bit of a tangent here, but the song "Slip Away" was originally called Uncle Floyd, and was originally meant to be on an album called Toy,
Yes.
which was what Bowie had intended to release after the album Hours, which and most of which was going to be re-recordings of songs from Bowie's, shall we say, pre-stardom era, predominantly 1960s stuff. And so I'd say the legendary Stardust Cowboy, you know, you know, song being on there is maybe just kind of, again, kind of a long slip away, a little bit of a nod to a man looking back at his past, and how he got to where he is. Neil Young, Bowie's talked a ton about his admiration for Neil Young. You know, Young was an inspiration for the song "Dead Man Walking," among other things.
No, I did not know that.
Bowie is one of many artists who have participated in the benefit concerts that Young organized for the Bridge School.
Yeah,
You know, going back. So I think that's admiration, and likewise the Pixies. You know, Bowie has been preaching the gospel of the Pixies going back to the certainly the late '80s, and I think for him it was also so maybe it was just also about showing that maybe part of his personality was about the artists um, that he championed. And look, on some level, I think he also just liked the songs
yeah,
and
yeah,
enjoyed kind of remaking them in his own image. But I think he also did want to maybe acknowledge, certainly in the case of the Pixies cover, um, how much he was fueled by younger bands, and that I think he's I don't think he's completely unique among his peers in this regard, but because certainly I think like Neil Young is definitely someone who fits this mold as well, but I think he wanted to you know I think he was fueled and fired by some of these younger bands, and that they I don't know, kept him honest, so to speak, as far as um, not giving him I don't know if it's competitiveness, but it maybe gave him reason to push himself, that he wanted to feel that I don't know. I'm kind of rambling a bit here. Sorry. Again, I think that he did these younger artists like Sonic Youth, like the Pixies, were the people that he just admired as far as pushing the boundaries of rock music, and he wanted to kind of give them some acknowledgement to maybe
yeah,
help broaden his fan base's mind. Bowie sort of had a comment about the Serious Moonlight tour, about how he looked out at this big audience and he wondered how many of them owned a Velvet Underground album. And and maybe there's a little bit of elitism in there somewhere, but it is David Bowie we're talking about. And so he's special, no matter what you want to say. He's a unique, amazing individual. And I think that including cover versions of artists that he just rated highly was a way for him to pay it forward, or is it pay it backward? I don't know anymore. But just to spotlight for people and help this the breadth of music out there. Look, it's not unlike his doing so many covers of Iggy Pop in the '80s. That
yeah,
he wanted to highlight this artist who he thought was just this amazing songwriter, and he you know and certainly he was aware that it was helping his friend financially, but I think he also genuinely wanted people to appreciate what Iggy Pop had to offer
yeah.
as an artist.
So before we started talking about the covers, you had said something that brings us close to the end of this conversation, which is no one would have anticipated what was going to happen next after Heathen. And what happened next, you alluded to it. Actually, he was able to get out one more album, Reality,
Yep.
and then he had a health issue, and he uh, went into a state of semi-retirement for a decade before the surprise release of The Next Day in 2013, which was, as you said earlier, was very well received. And then Blackstar, a little more than 2 years after that, and then he died. And Blackstar, which I think, Blackstar's been out in the world now for uh, close to 10 years, and I think we could say that it stands on its own. If Bowie was still alive, I think Blackstar would still be considered a great album. That
Right.
said, you can't divorce it from his death. And, it's viewed, I'm not saying anything new or innovative. It's viewed as an expression of his departure, like that he was conscious of it. So my hypothetical question is, say um, that was the timing of Heathen. Instead of going on hiatus, he died shortly after Heathen. Would
Yeah.
it be viewed the same way? Would it be viewed as, as Blackstar is like one of the great albums of, the 21st century so far?
Yeah, that's I always used to love as a kid the Marvel comic series What If, so it'd be
Yes,
things like what
yes,
if Spider-Man
yes,
joined the Fantastic
yes,
Four,
yes.
or if Jane Foster had gotten the power of Thor, which of course they ended up doing the latter one in main continuity, but that's neither here nor there. That that's always a tough question. What ifs are always a tough question. It's funny. I love them, but I also I try not to go too far down the rabbit hole. I I do I think that yeah, it's always tough to say. I think if I mean if the health issue that he had run into on the reality tour had been let's just say had he not gotten access to better medical care at the time, because I don't I feel a little morbid in talking about it so much. Um, and it was and an even earlier passing. Well, first off, I think it would have been even more shocking. So I don't even know, and I don't even know how that's possible because, of course, I I I can't. I still remember vividly almost falling out of bed, and I do mean literally when I heard on the morning news about his death because it had come, um, so soon, days after Blackstar's release, and but but it's tempered maybe just ever so slightly because the fact that he was, in his late 60s, and well, that's not I certainly don't, because our sense of what's old and young is obviously different nowadays, and you know we have Pete Townsend to thank for that on some level, I'm sure. But but I think that had he had that passing happen in his 50s, I definitely think that would have. I think it would have. I think that's the only thing that would have been more shocking. I think like
Yeah,
the only thing that would have been more shocking about dying when he actually did would have been if it had happened a decade or so earlier. And I do think that if those albums, certainly that tandem of Heathen and Reality, which are both, I think, really, really great albums in their own right, um, but and very different albums too. I I think that that would have I think that we would certainly we would have looked at Bowie as a person who had really I think that narrative of a person who had come kind of full circle back around to their artistry had I think that that same narrative would have existed. Now, some of that is admittedly because it's an easy narrative. It's one and one that the facts supported. Um, I think the funny thing about Blackstar is, as his final album, is that that how if the next day was sort of like the absolute vindication of, shall we say, the changes won,
yeah,
uh,
yeah,
David Bowie. Not that it doesn't reflect all of his sort of stylistic uh, elements, but if the next day probably leans a little more into that kind of changes what we would think of as the changes one Bowie. Uh, and Blackstar, on the other hand, is that's a little more station to station to scary monsters. Yeah,
yeah,
I think
sure,
and
yeah,
not it's not a pure easy the Venn diagram is a little wonky there, I'll admit, but the fact that I don't know there's a certain poetry to the fact that Bowie's perhaps his ultimately most acclaimed album, his only #1 album in the U.S. He had a whole bunch in the UK, but his only #1 album in the U.S. was among his boldest and just and most challenging. And that's man, if that's not artistry, I don't know what,
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
know. But no, but I think Heathen, would Heathen be perhaps better regarded, maybe sort of seen as that absolute masterwork? Yeah, I think I think there's a case to be made that it would have. I do believe that among his body of work, it's one of those albums that will, I think, kind of continue to, age like fine wine, as they say. Uh, Along with Outside, by the way, I
Yes.
think that,
Yeah.
and again, they're both albums that have, you know, what my nitpicky fan brain, thinks are flaws, or elements that, but I love them.
Yeah.
I love them both. I mean, I think, again, you name a Bowie album, I will name a song that I absolutely love, like,
Okay.
without fail.
So let's end on this. I think the last time we spoke, I asked you the question I ask everybody, which is what is your favorite Bowie song and album? This discussion is really about one album. So I'm going to ask you, to end on a superficial note, what's your favorite song off of Heathen?
Oh, it is Everyone Says Hi, for reasons that are in some ways too personal to relate. But the, it reminds me of a difficult time, and and yet, even as it makes me want to cry, it reminds me that that time is in the past, and
Yeah.
that I am past it. Um, and also, in retrospect, what just a couple thoughts about it. One is that, to me, it has always felt like, or maybe I say always, but certainly since Bowie's death, I look back at that song and I think that was Bowie. That song was Bowie facing off against mortality and winning at least a temporary victory. So at the end of the song, before he starts singing that kind of last chorus, um, when he sings "Everyone Says Hi" 3 times, and only then do the background vocals kick in. And to me, I'm just like, that's how you know it's a great artist, because an artist who is just good or just okay, the background vocals would have been there. You would have heard Gail Ann Dorsey right then and there. Um, you know, but you know, actually, she didn't. I don't think she sang on the album. I'm thinking of the live versions. But the but to me, the fact that he's willing to just let his voice be out there for that just emotional moment, um, unadorned or
Right.
unsupported, I should
Yeah.
say. Like, to me, I just think that, again, as much as we don't think of Bowie as the sort of traditional super emotive singer-songwriter, there is so much feeling in that song.
Yeah.
And you know, and it really, by the time you get to it, there's a lot of live versions out there on, YouTube and whatever. And when I hear them, and a lot of them, there, it's funny to hear just certain differences and certain instruments just a little more to the forefront. And but it's always a song where I feel like the the band's passion, because again, his touring band didn't play on the record, but when you hear that song live, and you hear how much they bring to it,
Yeah.
um, with him, it is just, it's just something beautiful. Um, my runner up, by the way, is probably Slip Away,
Yeah.
because I think there's just something about that, just beautifully wistful about that song. And again, and look, I'll admit, and also it helped that I got the reference to the Uncle Floyd show. So I mean, I felt, you know, I felt like pretty good there about that. But but yeah, it's again, it's look, it's just one that's stuck with me. I mean,
Yeah.
I love them all, but that one um, kind of stuck with me especially well.
Well, Don Cleese, we've been talking about Heathen. Great album. Thank you very much for joining me. So I'm saying this not to you, I'm saying this to the audience. If you enjoyed this conversation, if you enjoyed hearing Don's insights, I urge you to get his book, On Track David Bowie, 1983 to 2016. It contains many insights and it goes quickly. You read through it quickly and you start thinking about what David Bowie albums you like. So that was my reaction to it. So Don, this has been terrific. This is your second visit on my show. I hope you come back for a third and a fourth.
Well, that we'll have to figure out what album. I guess the question is, do I dare talk about an album I haven't written about? If it is, I would have to say I would if I got a chance to request it, I would say Station to Station because that is, I think, Bowie's perfect album, which is a different thing than his best album or my favorite album or whatever. But it's but no, I would love
Well,
to.
let's make a deal. Let's do that for its 50th anniversary in 2026.
That sounds like fun.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Great.
Brilliant.
Don Cleese, thank you very
Thank you
much.
again, John.
Can you hold on for just one moment?
Sure.
So that's the end of that. I'm going to blow my nose. Excuse me.
Yeah, that's cool. No worries.
Um, I wanted to ask you one last question that I'm not going to use for this, but
Yeah.
I'm trying, I want to see what I have, but I'm trying to pull together little clips from different people that I interview that I'm going to turn into a 10-year retrospective.
Okay. Yeah.
So I'm just going to ask you, this is not meant to be this long, involved answer, but something that will be used as a clip as part of a larger thing. And I wanted to ask, you wrote the book about the second half of his career. How do you think that part of his career has held up in the 10 years since his passing? So I'm going to ask you that question.
Okay.
Is that fair?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. So I'm going to do the very brief introduction.
Cool.
Don Cleese, author of On Track, David Bowie, 1983 to 2016, which is a book that covers every song David Bowie released during that period, the second half of his career. Don, thank you. Um, in the 10 years since David Bowie's passing, how do you think this half of his career has held up?
Great question. The the overriding thing that I found while going back to these albums and listening to them again is that what you get out of these albums is that Bowie, after he flirted with kind of global superstardom, which I guess he never really lost after Let's Dance, was that ultimately the he was an experimenter at heart. And so so after you're past that mid 80s period, the one he called derisively his Phil Collins years, what you have there is an artist who, even when they were superficially going down the road of just kind of grunge rock or whatever, into then a massive narrative focused collaboration with Brian Eno, or a reflective set of songs about middle age, or an even more reflective songs about middle age and what the heck kind of world are we living in early in the 21st century. And then I won't even get into his later works because there is someone who was always wanted to push themselves. And and I think the reason why maybe some of his 1980s stuff maybe didn't hold up as well was that he wasn't in a position to push himself for whatever reasons. But when you get into the kind of the core of that later part of his career, what you've got is a person who realizes that that stardom is uh, incidental to who they are as an artist.
Yeah.
that they're the
Yeah.
person who always, who is always looking at the possibilities of it, of what they can do. And were the results always perfect? Were they always great? No, objectively not. Not, of course, I say objectively as if we can ever be totally objective about any artist's work. But you can always look at things and say, well, there's aspects of that album that maybe don't hold up. But that whole period, even if you say, well, that album could have been better, maybe it would have been better if that album had lost a couple songs here and there, or if that B side had been on the album instead of, pick whatever song, all that nitpicking that we as fans just we love to do um, because only the people who truly love something can be that particular about it, of course. You know, if we when we really engage with that time, the he was always the artist we believed he was. He was always the person who believed in the possibilities of you know of going of rock music being something beyond the conventional. And so that I think it's just great in looking back on it, which I got to do writing this book and really re-listening. Um, I'm amazed that we got some of this stuff. I'm amazed that he convinced a record company to release it, going back to some of those 90s albums like Outside. And and I know we should focus on the artistry, not the business sense of it. But then again, that was part of his genius that he understood this world that he lived in, and he found the ways to get this work done and get it out there. And he just never, he never stopped till the end of it. And also um, thinking of Blackstar for a moment, because of course it is his final work. He according to his producer Tony Visconti, when he was getting ready to do that, he told Visconti that the band they were going to be recording it with, this band that was predominantly a jazz group, but were skilled, really just you know to the utmost, and could rock pretty hard when they wanted to. uh, he told Visconti, "Hey, we're the ones who have to up our game. It's not that the jazz musicians had to, change anything for them, that they were the ones who had to up their game." And I think that's maybe the greatest testament to Bowie as an artist, and I think why so much of this work from that post Scary Monsters period, is I think ultimately going to be viewed, will continue to be viewed more favorably, I think, as years go on. And I
Yeah.
think we get to view that whole body of work, in its entirety. It's sad that, it's not being added to, of course, but to the extent there's a silver lining, we get to experience it as a whole and appreciate that he was always that his restlessness creatively, um, that however much it benefited him, we as listeners and fans also benefited immensely.
Yeah. Don, thank you very much.
Thank you, John.
Okay, and that's it. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks a lot.
All right, I'll give you the heads up before it's
Yeah,
posted.
thank you. Thank
Yeah.
you.
All right, and let's talk again next year.
I love it. Thanks so
Yeah.
much. Take care.
All right, I'll talk to you soon.
Bye now.